Good morning, U.S. history. Today we are going to talk about Native American affairs in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, most particularly relating to the Native Americans that lived in the Great Plains, henceforth known as the Plains Natives. Now, this is really the dark side of the American West, because this does not paint the U.S. government in a very complimentary picture at all, mostly because they mishandled a lot of things in this time. The Great Plains region was already inhabited when all of the white settlers started showing up, mostly home to the Plains Native Americans, including tribes such as the Cheyenne, the Comanche, and the Sioux tribe. The Sioux tribe is made up of the Lakota and the Dakota, sometimes kind of the same thing. It depends on, it's mostly the three different dialects that they speak. Okay, so your Plains, you've got your Cheyenne, Comanche, and Sioux, but we'll mostly be focusing on the Sioux today. They lived in teepees, they hunted buffalo on horseback, they fought American cavalry with bow and arrow, and but the thing is, like, a lot of these things were much more important and much more vital than we generally think of them. So the key to the survival was the buffalo. The men of the tribes riding on horses descended by those left by the Spanish were the ones who hunted the buffalo, usually in herds so large that they would blacken the Great Plains. They would make it look black because the buffalo herds were so big. Then the Native Americans ate a great deal of buffalo meat, either fresh or dried in strips, in like jerky strips, or dried and mixed with berries called pemmican. Buffalo hide provided clothing, provided blankets, curtains, drumheads, tent coverings, other necessities. Buffalo sinews and tendons provided bowstrings, thread for sewing, and some Native Americans made dice out of buffalo bones for gambling. Even the dung of the buffalo was dried and burned as fuel. So really, the Native Americans could live their entire life around the buffalo. Buffalo were so important that during the wars, the U.S. government quietly encouraged the slaughtering of the buffalo because that would harm the Native Americans and their means of survival. By 1900, huge herds of the buffalo were nearly extinct. And some historians believe that this was actually this hurt the Native Americans way more than any specific war waged against them. The Americans trying to lay claims out there soon learned that the Plains people were very skilled warriors. They could dash around on horses, fire arrows almost as fast as any man could fire a repeating rifle. The Native Americans were independent fighters, and one-on-one, quite frankly, they would beat most white settlers. However, the government learned that they could be divided. They weren't very unified across tribes. And so that was one of the things that the government did when they were fighting them. The Native Americans also were quickly learning that you can't trust the United States government, even when government officials may be intended to be fair. Their lack of understanding of the Native American culture, and quite frankly, their lack of desire to understand the Native American culture, really hindered things. One thing they also didn't understand was that a chief couldn't sign a treaty on behalf of an entire group of people. The chiefs did not rule like large states. They weren't like governors. And so a lot of times the United States government would sign a treaty with one chief and then try and enforce it over a very large area, not understanding that the chief didn't rule that whole area. So let's talk about the wars. From the 1850s to the 1870s, there was a series of campaigns, usually called the Sioux Wars because they mostly were against the Sioux Native Americans. The first Sioux War in the Wyoming-Montana region, was from 1866 to 1868, and it was one of the first wars that the United States Army ever lost. Now, your book says the first. That's not true. The United States Army definitely lost one or two of the Seminole Wars earlier in the 1800s. However, this was more of a formal conflict, and they did lose. Okay, so you've got your first Sioux War, which again was 1866 to 1868, so right on the heels of the Civil War. You have Captain William Fetterman basically bragged that if he had 80 men, he could go and destroy the entire Sioux Nation. Well, he had 80 men, and they were all slaughtered by a Native American tribe when he went to fight them. It was near Fort Phil Kearny, and Fetterman and his troops met a large Sioux war party and were pretty much slaughtered down to the last man. In fact, this war, again, like it says, might have a kind of unusual distinction of being one of the early wars that the United States lost. We just don't like to talk about it. The goal of the Native American Wars was 100% to force the tribes onto reservations. Okay, so goal. So your reservations are stemming back from Jackson's presidency when he passed the Indian Removal Act and forced all of the Cherokee and the southeastern tribes out to Oklahoma on reservations. Reservations are special tracts of land set aside where they could theoretically live in peace. But we've already seen yesterday how the Cherokee were forced to move to Oklahoma, and by the 1870s and 60s, the United States is giving away land in Oklahoma that they said would be safe for the Native Americans. Some people probably thought that this was a helpful policy, but honestly, most people just wanted to get the Native Americans out of the way so that they could seize the lands. The Native Americans could see no reason why they should bother leaving, and so a lot of them stayed and fought. They also realized that they were being asked to move to a place that maybe didn't have the resources they were used to, didn't have the type of land that they could use. And generally speaking, the land that the government used for reservation was land that they couldn't see any other good uses for. Usually you couldn't farm there. It was very hard to live there. And they said, oh, well, you can have that land. Right, like they want to go. Pardon? Drop my marker. Okay. So we'll talk about the Second Sioux War, more commonly known as the Sioux War. Same goal. They still wanted to force the tribes onto reservations. However, this one was different. It was from 1876 to 77. And it was fought mostly because the reason why it's famous is because it was the last great conflict between the Native Americans and the United States armies, and partially because the personalities involved were so strong. The United States Army was led by a man named George Armstrong Custer. And Custer was quite the personality. He rose through the ranks during the Civil War because he was reckless, he was daring, and he constantly wanted to impress people. So, for example, during the Peninsular Campaign, McClellan was riding along the Chickahominy River, and McClellan said, "Man, I wish I knew how deep this river was." And so Custer dashed his horse into the river, crossed back, came back, and said, "That's how deep it is, General." And the general was so impressed that he promoted him to captain. Typical of Custer's method was the Battle of Washita, the Battle of the Washita River, in 1868 in what is today Oklahoma. Basically, he came up on a Native American camp in the banks of the river. He divided his force and prepared to attack without any reconnaissance, so without investigating the area, without seeing how many there were, without a game plan. He just divided his force and attacked. And it was a smashing success because the Native Americans were super surprised. And it turned out that some of the Native Americans had been raiding white settlements, but Custer had not known that beforehand, and quite frankly, he didn't care. Custer was super racist and was very much against the Native Americans being present. So who opposed him? Well, you have the two Sioux chiefs, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. Sitting Bull was more of the political leader, and he provided moral inspiration, led negotiations with any of the United States officials. Crazy Horse was more of the commander of the Sioux warriors. Under Crazy Horse's leadership, the Sioux warriors fought one of the most unified, best organized campaigns in history, particularly for the Native Americans. The major battle took place in 1876, and that was Custer's regiment coming upon a huge Native American camp on the banks of the Little Bighorn River in what is now Montana. Unknown to Custer, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse noted his approach and were prepared for him. However, Custer's scouts looked at the size of the camp and basically said, "Hang on a second, there's more of them than we have bullets. So even if we used every single one of our bullets successfully, which the odds of that are unlikely, we would still not be able to get rid of them all, and then we'd have no ammo." However, Custer basically said, no, 8 years ago I did a great thing and I'm going to do it again. So we're going to divide forces, attack from two sides. One force under Marcus Reno attacked the camp head on and was soon driven back, and basically the Native Americans were super ready for that attack, so they fought him back. And then Custer took some 200 men, swept north of the Indian camp to launch what he thought would be a surprise attack. However, the Native Americans surprised Custer because they knew what it was coming, and perhaps took probably about 2,000 Native American soldiers out to meet Custer's 200 men. Needless to say, Custer did not win. In fact, Custer and all of his force of 200 lost their lives in the Battle of Little Bighorn, more popularly known as Custer's Last Stand, because it was the last battle he ever fought. Okay, so that is your Battle of Little Bighorn. And it was a huge Native American victory that actually hurt them, because they were so happy that they had won. They thought that they had won the entire war. And so a lot of Sioux left Sitting Bull's force. And shocked and sobered by the defeat, the American government said, no, we are going to send more men, more people. And within months of Custer's defeat, the United States Army actually had overwhelmed the Native Americans, most of whom had gone home thinking that the war was over. Most Sioux sadly had to go to the reservations. Crazy Horse had to surrender himself and actually died in a scuffle with the soldiers because he did not want to surrender. Sitting Bull fled to Canada for a time and eventually returned, only to be killed by the Native American police for allegedly inciting them to rebel. So that was kind of the end of the Second Sioux War, which was really the end of most of the formal fighting. The fate of the Sioux was very typical to what's happening in the tribes in the West. Some Native Americans still resisted the idea of living a dull, impoverished life on the barren reservations. Gee, I wonder why. The Apache Geronimo, for example, yes, his name was Geronimo, led a small band of Native Americans who for several years frustrated the Army's attempts to force them onto a reservation. So he was leading a resistance. He and his band were finally captured. The Nez Perce, Chief Joseph, conducted a campaign to try and save his tribal lands, but was forced to surrender in 1877. So the Native Americans, quite frankly, they don't have the numbers, they don't have the organization, and the United States has plenty of people. They can keep sending more people. And really, this end comes in 1890 at something called the Wounded Knee Massacre. So the Wounded Knee Massacre is probably the most brutal and one of the most embarrassing for the United States incidents of the Native American Wars. So basically, in Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota, the Army tried to disarm and capture a band of Sioux who were resisting removal from their land, specifically Lakota Sioux. The chief knew he was outnumbered and began to surrender, but one brave fighter fired a wild shot at the soldiers. Didn't hit anybody, it was just fired. But fighting quickly broke out. The United States ordered an attack. However, they'd already confiscated most of the weapons from the Native Americans, so they ordered this attack on Native Americans who are largely women and children and largely, completely weaponless. And so fighting quickly broke out. When it was over 25 soldiers, your book says more than 150 Native Americans. Other intel says closer to 250 to 300 Native Americans, half of which were women and children, were dead at the end of this. Because again, the attack had been ordered after they disarmed most of the Native Americans, and so they had no weapons to fight back. And so you have this group of 250 to 300 Native Americans that were completely massacred without the opportunity to fight back. And that's the Wounded Knee Massacre. It's sad, it's bloody, it's disgusting, and that's how the Native American Wars ended. Okay, so it's by Wounded Knee Creek, which is why they call it the Wounded Knee Massacre. Again, probably 250 to 300 Lakota Sioux were killed. Again, half of them women and children. So in 1881, Helen Hunt Jackson publishes a book called A Century of Dishonor. And this book calls the government out for a lot of things. The ruthless and dishonorable dealings with the Native Americans. In 1887, Congress tries to undo some of the damage by passing the Dawes Act. And the Dawes Act actually allows Indian lands to be parceled out to individual families to use and develop as they like. However, Native Americans live in tribes, not so much in families, and so this actually tended to break down the unity of the tribes. And a lot of Native Americans just sold their land and tried to live off of that money and became very impoverished. In the 20th century, the U.S. government tried to redress some of the wrongs. In 1924, Congress gave Native Americans full citizenship, even though they were there first. And in 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act halted the allotment program of the Dawes Act and gave the reservations limited self-government. Congress also made it easier for Native Americans to sue for damages, but ultimately speaking, do these things make up for the injustices done? Most people don't think so. So this is kind of, after this you have very little Native American resistance anymore because there aren't enough Native Americans left to resist. And they've been so beaten down, so killed, so massacred that their motivation is gone to fight back. So with that said, on that cheerful note, we're going to finish up our lesson for today. Tomorrow we're going to talk about international expansion. And tomorrow we're actually going to finish up the chapter. So start studying, and you'll receive an email and a post on the Google Calendar talking about what activities that you'll need to be completing. Okay? As a reminder, your notes for these chapters are going to be due. They don't have to be super detailed, but you do need to go through the chapter, kind of get the gist of it. Okay? So I hope you guys have an awesome rest of your day, and I will see you all later. Bye.